Hello all, this is Joshua Johnson.
What's up, everyone? This is Tommy Kellogg.
So Tommy, tell me, how did we meet?
Good question, Josh. We actually met as students at Yeshiva University, where we both received a master's degree in Jewish studies. During that time, we both had the passion and idea to create some sort of outlet for our interest in Jewish-Christian dialogue. And through that, we thought a podcast would be a great platform.
Indeed, in this podcast, we discuss the historic and modern intersection of faith and culture rooted in the common heritage of the Abrahamic faiths. We have deep discussions with people who are active in their faith communities and building bridges between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and our shared connections to the Holy Land.
Welcome to Embracing Abraham.
On today's podcast, we are welcome to have Dr. Amos Guiora with us. I found his story fascinating because of my connection as a volunteer with the Looted Books Project. The Looted Books Project restores books that were stolen by the Nazis and are finding their way to descendants of the original owners through volunteer genealogists.
If you're interested in learning more about the Looted Books Project, feel free to reach out to us at askjcpod@gmail.com. You can also find more information about Dr. Guiora's book at crimeofcomplicity.com.
Abraham podcast. This is Joshua Johnson, and I'm my co-host, Tommy Kellogg.
What's up?
And we're welcome to introduce Dr. Amos Guiora, live from Israel right now, Jerusalem. How's it going? We will say that this podcast may be interrupted by rocket, fire, or sirens, so we want to make best use of time, and we're really grateful to have Dr. Guiora with us today. Just a quick introduction. Dr. Guiora is a law professor at the University of Law, where he directs the Bystander Initiative, which we hope to talk about. He has written the crime of complicity, the bystander in the Holocaust, and the complicity of silence, confronting ecosystems of child sexual abuse in schools. And there's a lot of things that we want to talk about, but just to go right into it, how did growing up in Israel as a child of children of the Holocaust, the Shoah, impact your trajectory and entry into law?
So a couple of cool things. You said I teach at the University of Law. I teach law at the University of Utah. And the third book that's relevant to this conversation is The Armies of Enablers, Betrayal and Complicity in Sexual Assaults. So to your question, I was born here in Israel, but we moved to the States right before first grade, and I moved back here 40 years ago when I was right after law school. To your question about being raised so both my parents were Holocaust survivors, but I was, as an only child, when I was 12, my father took me canoeing, and I don't know why canoeing, but took me canoeing and told me the following: in 1 minute, I will share my story. In 1 minute, I will share your mother's story. And this is the first and last time we will ever have this conversation. And they meant what they said, and they said what they meant. There was no book about the Holocaust in our house. I never heard the word Holocaust in our house. 15 years ago, a little bit less, while training for the Salt Lake Marathon, my running partner, who's not Jewish, asked me, how did this being the Holocaust, how did this happen? And I had a brilliant academic answer, which was, I have no idea. And this was on a Saturday morning, and I decided that afternoon the time has come, I'm 68 today, so what was I then, 55, to become, I can't say autodidactic on the Holocaust, because I'm not a Holocaust scholar, but I started reading a lot, and it quickly became apparent to me, or clear to me, that there was an issue that had never really been addressed, and that's the role of the bystander from a legal perspective. There have been two books written about the bystander, one by Victoria Barnett, who's a sociologist, and the other book by Hilberg, the great historian, but there had never been a book written about the bystander and the Holocaust from a legal perspective. And so that's the book, The Crime of Complicity. And that was in many ways, first of all, my initial foray into the Holocaust. But for me, more importantly than that, I finally, not 100%, but largely um, came to understand what my parents' experiences have been, because I knew nothing about my parents. When my mom died 3 years ago at the Shiva, I learned things that I did not know, which I thought I knew her full story. I did not. But I think now I do, and that is, I'm addressing that in a new book. And my father's story, I think I know his story. Never say 100%, but a lot of it, most of it, I know.
Hmm. Can you explain the bystander initiative?
Sure, it's a program we did establish at the law school 3 years ago, in large part as a result of the books I referenced, The Crime of Complicity and Armies of Enablers, and then subsequently the book that you referenced, the book about the boy who was murdered, The Silence of Complicity, Complicity of Silence, Silence of Complicity. We've been extremely fortunate to be the beneficiaries of incredible generosity by donors. There's a scholarship on my father's name. That scholarship was given by a person who had been a student of my dad's at the University of Michigan, who was counting, I think, 55 or 60 years ago, and he views my father as his mentor. And he gave a very, very generous gift that enabled us to give a yearly fellowship scholarship on my dad's name. And there's no words for the generosity and the graciousness of a wide swath of donors that have given us very generously. And it's essential because this is a donor-driven project that has two or three primary focuses. One is the criminalization of the enabler and the bystander. Two is to write books and articles. And three is to engage with legislators around the world in the spirit to criminalize enablers and bystanders. And so, as an example, last night I was in a webinar. Unfortunately, I had to record it in advance because, again, I'm trying to always be one step ahead of the bombs, right? With a group that met with legislators. So I think 15 or 19 different states in the United States. I've testified in the Netherlands and I've testified in Australia on this. And the students who work with me, again, donor-based, we've written articles, books, lectures, expert testimony, interviews from here to there and back. And the point really is, A, to educate the public about the need to hold bystanders and enablers accountable, to working with legislators, working with the public, working with the media. And I've been beyond fortunate, in addition to the donors, to have students who have truly dedicated themselves to this. And obviously, I'm the beneficiary, I think that's the right word, of extraordinary leadership at the law school that fully understands the importance of this project.
I think I did want to ask a question about that, actually. So I remember even probably around the time of back in 2020 with the police protests in a lot of places after some of the George Floyd stuff and some of the other ones. Mainly, he was sort of the catalyst. I remember at the time there became, at least I became aware of this idea that on social media or like with yourself or with companies or organizations, if you don't say something, then you are also guilty in a way of supporting that thing. So in your opinion, I guess with this bystander initiative and sort of in your studies and really you're speaking on this, to what extent do you think someone should be legally bound, or even I guess maybe from a cultural standpoint, I don't know, how are they bound to intercede when knowing something is wrong? Or is it really more, because I know Josh and I were sort of talking about this earlier, like, is it something where if I witness a crime, should I be bound to, or I use an example to him of like, if I'm at a sporting event and two guys get into a fight in the stands, is it something that if one of them is injured, then you think I should be like, where's the cutoff line, or is there one really?
So legislation that was passed in Utah, I don't know, 4 years ago, perhaps, it was the result of the great efforts of a Utah former legislator, former state representative Brian King, with who I've been working with on bystander legislation probably since 2017, 2018. And then the bill was ultimately passed when it was rolled into mandatory reporting So the bystander obligation applies to vulnerable children and vulnerable elderly adult, the elderly. And the bill passed, I think, unanimously 4 years ago, if I recall correctly. To your question, the bill very clear says that if you are a bystander and you see a vulnerable individual, the only expectation legally is to dial 911. There's no expectation that you intercede and intervene. If you see two guys fighting each other, well, they're two idiots. Then you just,
Right.
dial 911, or you go to the some security fellow at the baseball game, or wherever you are. The law is very clear that there's a two-part test. You have knowledge, you see it, and two, that you have the ability to act, cell phone, but no, under no condition, the expectation, legal expectation, that you intervene in any way. With respect to social media, it's a very important question. Representative King made the decision. It was, he is the legislator. I just wrote the book. Representative King was of the belief that we could only hold a bystander criminally accountable if they're physically present. And because on social media, the two of you know much more about social media than I do, you actually don't know if what you're seeing written is actually what you're seeing written, or you see what you're seeing is actually something that is actually occurring. And in that context, there's under no circumstances is it possible to hold someone, again, legally accountable, culpable. So for us, the legislation in Utah, I think the 15, somewhere between the 15th to the 20th state that passed such legislation. That I think right now there are between 25 to 30 countries that have this. With respect to the enabler, who's different, because the enabler is not physically present. The enabler is the person who should know, or because of position and status. There is no such legislation that criminalizes the enabler anywhere in the world. The closest we got was in the Netherlands. The way legislation works in the Netherlands, a bill is passed, and then it has to be actually written. Unfortunately, there's an interim, and in that interim, the government fell. So we have a bill, but no language. So there's no enabler law in the Netherlands. We'll see what happens down the road. But this is really, to your question, this is really what I work on is the criminalization and working with legislators to convince them of that. But again, the critical thing with the bystander, physically present, the enabler is different. They're not there, right? They're distinct from the bystander, but they are, because of their position, their status. And as I wrote about, I don't know if you guys are sports fans, but if you think about the athletes from Michigan State, Michigan State, Ohio State, USA Gymnastics, where the coaches, trainers knew what the doctors were doing at Ohio State, Michigan State, USA Gymnastics. Those doctors were enabled by enablers. And for me, those are people who absolutely must be held accountable.
That would make sense to me, since they knew and they had some sort of a position of power to make it.
And they knew,
make a
and
change,
they knew,
right?
and I can demonstrate. So, for instance, in the book that Josh mentioned, the book about the boy who was murdered, Jeremy Bell, the pedophile had been a pedophile for 30 years, and it's documented. And parents and kids had complained to school administrators and so on, so on, so on, so on. And they were invariably, over the course of 30 years, pardon my hand motion, but fobbed off, move on. And for me, those people who went forward and complained, and they were fobbed off by the school administrators. Those school administrators are enablers. And the fact that they did not act in the face of consistent complaints against a pedophile, they are enablers, and they need to be held accountable. Unfortunately, this boy was murdered by his teacher, so the pedophile is in jail forever. Fine, but that's not what's important. The question is how do you break the ecosystem of enabling, and that's the critical question.
Now, this passion of yours came from your experience with your parents, and obviously, I don't think you met your grandparents, correct? Am I correct?
No, So as I look at my grandparents, so my paternal grandparents were murdered in Auschwitz in May of 1944. My maternal grandparents, whose picture I have looking right at me, they survived the Holocaust. My grandmother and my mother were in hiding in the attic. My mother's literally Anne Frank. My grandmother and my mother survived the Holocaust in Hungary in the attic. They were twice taken to be shot. My maternal grandfather, was in a work camp in Ukraine. Complicated story, which I don't really know the details, but he somehow escapes. I don't know the details. Comes back to Budapest, literally runs into my grandmother and my mother on the street in Budapest. My mother escapes from Hungary to Israel in March of 49, and my grandparents came in 1956. I don't know if before, during, or after the Hungarian Revolution of November 1956, and they lived in Israel until they both died in 1976 and 1980. And I had a great relationship with my maternal grandparents. My
Awesome.
paternal grandparents, as I look at a picture of my maternal grandmother, which is here next to me, my paternal grandmother, I know I have nothing of my paternal grandfather until the books that I got received this past March. So I grew up not knowing anything about any of this.
But yeah, what was it like? I want to hone in on that. What was it like to receive these books from the Looted Books Project from your grandfather, Shlomo Natan Goldberg?
Yep. So I was actually home in December, here in December, sitting in our living room, and it's 11:30 at night, and I get an email with the subject line, "My grandfather's name." So it's 11:30 at night, and I see my grandfather's name in the subject line, and I assume my first thought was either spam or some adjective of whatever kind. And then I read the email, which said, "Dear Professor Guiora, my name is. We are the Looted Books Project. Are you the grandson of and the son of?" And I'm not the overwhelmed type. I am not the overwhelmed type. I am not the emoting type. To tell you that I was overwhelmed would be probably all-time understatement, because it was 11:30 at night. I couldn't wake up my wife and I couldn't wake up my kids, right? So I quickly texted friends in America. And I said, like, whoa, incredible story. And the next morning when my wife and I said, like, wow. I mean, I don't know anything other than to say, wow, that the letter told me indeed that this extraordinary project based in Nuremberg had found 4 books with my grandfather's name embossed on the cover of the book, and they play detective. You guys are too young to know who Columbo was, but Columbo was the famous TV detective in the 1970s. One More Question, played by Peter Falk. They found my grandfather's name, which is embossed in the books. And what they did then is they went to Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Center here in Israel. In 1981, my father had filled out all the forms, and not only our last name is Guiora, but it had been Goldberg. And so they found my father through their data bank, and then they Googled my father, who had been a professor at the University of Michigan. And when my dad died 10 years ago this October, there were all these articles about my dad. But the best thing about all those articles about my father is that they said that Professor Guiora's son teaches law at the University of Utah. And that's how they got to me. And then my wife and I said, we'll get on a plane and fly to Nuremberg right now. Doesn't work like that, because they want to make sure that I am me, that I am indeed the son of and the grandson of. And there were correctly, a fair number of questions. Plus, I had to sign a contract in English and German. And then the books were mailed to my apartment in Salt Lake City, because I teach at the University of Utah, as you mentioned. When I opened the books, one of my friends said, film yourself opening the package. But I'm such a klutz, I couldn't figure out how you take the phone and how you record yourself. I couldn't figure out how to do that. But we now have the 4 books. I'm an only child. My father had a brother, also a professor of psychology. They're both deceased. He had 2 sons, both deceased. But my cousin has 2 children, and we will keep 2 books, and 2 books will go rightly so to my cousin's children. That's the right thing to do. It is beyond extraordinary, and there are no words that I can sufficiently express my gratitude to the team that in Germany, the volunteers that work on this extraordinary project. The irony of ironies is the 4 books are the Talmud, and they were found in the private library of Streicher, who was the editor of Der Strömer, which was the Nazi newspaper. he viewed himself not only as an expert on Judaism, but it is what it is. He viewed himself as an expert on the Talmud.
Hmm.
And so it's fair to assume that this, pardon my English, but this vile human being, that's being polite, right, held my grandfather's books. Right. On the other hand, as a friend of mine told me, he says, Streicher, he was hung after Nuremberg. My grandfather was murdered in Auschwitz, and the book survived. And we have the books. And somebody said to me, is that maybe victory? I said, maybe that is victory. Streicher held the books, hung, my grandfather murdered, but the book survived. And I, as the third generation, second generation of my father, third generation of my grandfather, we have the books. And I have two books right above my head, and there are two books in our living room. And as
Can we
I say,
see
I'll
one?
give two.
Can we see
Sure.
one?
Absolutely.
That's awesome. I was going to ask if you had them.
Oh,
Did they send them all to Salt Lake City, or did they send
Yes.
them to? Okay.
yes.
I
And,
know you
and
mentioned.
they
I
sent
didn't
the
know if
four
any.
to Salt Lake City.
Okay.
I don't know if you can see it. And you can actually see my grandfather's name embossed. Can you
Yeah,
can you see that as
a
a
little bit.
screen?
See the
That's his
Hebrew
name
in the
embossed.
middle.
And I don't
Yeah.
right in the middle.
Yeah. Still
Oh,
no
that's his
nothing.
name.
Yeah.
Is that amazing?
Yeah. Goldberg.
And
Yeah.
the box that they was sent in. University of Utah has a rare book expert, and he said these boxes are like the best boxes there are.
Oh.
And there are no words. And I know very little about my grandfather, my paternal grandfather, but this is what he took with him to Auschwitz. And I remind you that, the Jews were told to pack their belongings when they were deported. And my father grew up in abject, in his words, in abject poverty. And what is it my grandfather takes with him to Auschwitz? Books. One of the questions which I don't know the answer to, and I'm dying to delve into this, is, so he arrives with this, he schleps the books with him. Somebody opens a brief, I don't even know if he had a suitcase, I don't even know what he had, right? How the books why those four books make their way from Auschwitz to Streicher, from Auschwitz to Nuremberg, because it's a Talmud and it's in Yiddish, and it's published in 1850, but it was written in the 1600s, whatever. I guess if I had, if and when I have time, I would love to play my own Columbo, to figure all this out, because there's a story here to be told.
Yeah, definitely.
Could be an intriguing movie. Yeah.
So that's interesting you say that. I've been asked, like, when's the book coming out? I said, okay, slowly. Somebody else said to me, when's the play? I was like, oh. And then somebody else said to me, who's the movie and who's playing you? I said, well, one step at a time. But it is, in a moment of seriousness, it is a remarkable and incredible story. And because my focus is on enablers, right? The book from here, I know how it made its way from my grandfather's hometown in Hungary to Auschwitz. I get that train, schlep. From Auschwitz to here, every step of the way there are enablers. And so somebody has told me that using the theme of the enablers, that I need to go to Auschwitz. I've never been to Auschwitz. To go to Auschwitz, to their archives, to try to figure out, piece together the puzzle of how it is that these books were chosen, randomly or not. I have no idea, don't know. In Streicher's private library, from what I've learned, there were 9,000 books. I understand now why these books were of importance to him, but it's also a question to me, did somebody at Auschwitz know that Streicher was interested in the Talmud? And does that, for instance, mean that the Jews who were in Auschwitz were told to look at the books to tell the Germans what the books were? I've been told, but again, I want to be really careful here, and I want to be highly respectful of others, that this is something that has, why these books from here to here is something that has not been written about. So as I understand, does it intrigue me? Absolutely. At the moment, I'm working on other projects, but it's on my, what do you call it? The to-do list.
You could do like a history of the book, through the lens of this particular book.
So that
It's like
is a
the book
really,
lives
Josh,
on.
that's so. Somebody's told me that I need to write up. The book would be like a journey of the 4 books in 3 countries, right? From Hungary to Poland to Germany and ending up obviously in the States now in Israel. I mean, it's literally full circle. We'll see.
Hmm.
Yeah, that'd be an awesome book and movie, I think. Be interesting.
I'll tell you what, in your free time, you're welcome to write the damn thing.
We'll see what happens. So that's crazy. I'm amazed. So I do have a question, I guess it's a little bit more, a little bit off the lines of that, but like, how did you end up in Utah?
By plane.
Well, yeah, that makes sense.
When I retired so I moved to Israel exactly 40 years ago in August of 85 after graduating from law school in the States. I served for 20 years in the IDF and the Judge Advocate General Corps. And when I retired from the IDF, the question was, what's next? And I came to teach at Case Western Reserve in Cleveland for a year because that's where I'd gone to law school. And I stayed there for 3 years. And then the way that these things work in academia, the gentleman who had been the associate dean at Case got named dean at University of Utah, recruited me, and I've been there since 2007.
Okay.
So my 40-year career, modest career since graduating from law school, 20 years in the IDF and 20 years in academia.
Okay. Cool. Thanks for sharing. Yeah, I was just curious about. I was like, what's the connection to Utah and Judaism?
It's a typical academic, that somebody knew you, recruited you, and
yeah. Nice. It's good to know people sometimes.
So your father, right, Alexander Guiora,
Right.
he gave a speech. I read they gave a speech about the Holocaust to a group of Jewish Christian, a kind of conference or Catholic conference.
Wow.
And he didn't mention the word Holocaust, and it went down as like one of the best.
This is an incredible story. Look at you. So I never knew about this. I mind you, I didn't know anything about the Holocaust. Probably 25 years ago, 23 or 25 years ago, you're 100% correct. The Hungarian Catholic Church, under the auspices of the Vatican, did a mea culpa. And they organized a huge conference. And they looked for a keynote speaker, and there were 3 conditions to the keynote speaker. One, that it had to be a Holocaust survivor from Hungary. 2, had to be a world-class academic. And 3, was someone who would speak Hungarian. Google brought them to my father. And my father said he has 2 conditions. He will not speak Hungarian, and he will speak the truth. They said, we'll waive the Hungarian, the truth we need to think about. And he said, well, then I guess this isn't going to work out. Thanks for reaching out, and goodbye. And I don't know if you say negotiate, because I don't know I never knew any of this firsthand. But whatever they worked out, and indeed, you are 100% correct. He went with my mom. My mom did not go to the talk. I didn't even know that they were there. I didn't know anything about this. Not in front of the children. I mean, in my case, not in front of the child, right? The following year, he was invited to a follow-up conference, and my mom told me, tell him to take you. And I said, well, that's fine, but I wanted to take our 3 children as well. And my father said, absolutely not. So I went with my dad, and I had a great, I'm one of those very fortunate people who had a great relationship with his father. And I went with him when he gave the talk, which was the second time. It was in Hungarian. The only words I understood was when he said CNN. I had no idea what the hell he was talking about. And we spent 4 miserable days together in Hungary on a roots trip, because I want to take pictures of him, no pictures allowed. I want to video him, no video allowed. I want to ask questions, and it didn't really work. But I mean, the whole thing's extraordinary. When I started looking into the bystander and the Holocaust, my running partner is the one who found Victoria Barnett, who I told you there were 2 great books about the bison, one's by Barnett, one's by Yelberg. And I met with Barnett, and there are no words for Dr. Barnett. And then I get a phone call from her one day, and she says to me, "Are you Professor Guiora's son?" I said, "I am." She said, "Do you know about the talk he gave in Budapest at this conference?" And I said to Dr. Barnett, I said, "I have no idea what you're talking about." And she said, "You need to know that your father's talk is considered by Holocaust scholars to be maybe the most impactful speech ever given by a Holocaust survivor." I was like, I have no idea what the hell you're talking about. And she said, "What makes this talk so extraordinary is indeed, Josh, you're 100% right, does not say the word Holocaust once. He talked about reconciliation." So when my dad, for his 90th birthday, 10 years ago, right before he died, shortly before he died, we self-published a book based on that talk. And we had others, comment. And we self-published it and we sent it out to a gazillion people. I confess, I have read his talk a couple of times. My father was at an intellectual level that is way above me. I don't understand the talk, but I'll take the compliment on his behalf when Dr. Barnett says it's one of the greatest speeches ever given by a Holocaust survivor. What is interesting, as I said to my mom, "What do you think about this talk?" And she hadn't read it either. And then I told her that he talked about reconciliation and didn't mention the word Holocaust. And my mom said, "That's all bullshit." I said, "Well, I don't know. He wrote it, And she didn't agree with it. I think that's the right word. That he talked about reconciliation. And they never discussed this ever. By the way, my mother did not know my father's story. My father did not know my mother's story. My mother could not wrap her mind around the fact that my father, at this huge conference, talked about reconciliation. She just she could not grapple with that. The way she reconciled it is she said, well, if he would have given the talk, 20 years before that, no way would he have talked about reconciliation. And she said, well, maybe as he got older, he got whatever. My mother came from the school of thought that says never forgive, never forget. And my father evidently came from the school that said never forget, but forgive. And I want to emphasize that he survived 2 death marches. I mean, his Holocaust story, and his parents were murdered, right? But I never discussed this ever with my dad. The only time we ever discussed the Holocaust, he died in October of 2015. In June of 2015, right around the time of his birthday, he was cognitively impaired. He had fallen. It had met sidewalk winds for 2 days while I was writing Crimes of Complicity. I don't know anything about neurology, but the wires came back, and the first and only time we ever talked about his Holocaust experiences was those 2 days. And I asked if we could film him, and he said no. And my mom said later that maybe he didn't think. My father was very conscious of how he looked. There's a great picture of my dad right here. He was a good-looking dude, right? But maybe he felt that he didn't look good. He was self-conscious, which I thought was unfortunate. So, what he told me, I put into the book. I included in the book, but he didn't let me record him, which is unfortunate.
Wow. So pretty recently, that's when you've been able to reconnect yourself with that story of the Holocaust, because they didn't speak at all about it, which is really interesting. But how do you think that impacted you? Like, to not speak about something, do you think that had a negative impact, or do you think, like, as a psychology professor that he was, you would think that he would want to, maybe it was just too much for him? But
it's a very interesting question. There's a lot of literature on this. Holocaust survivors are divided into 2 camps. Camp 1 is they don't talk about anything, like my parents. Camp 2 is every dinner conversation with their kids is about the Holocaust. And I have friends like that. When my parents got married, in 55, 56, they made a deal with each other that they would never share their story with their children. But as I subsequently learned, they also didn't share it with each other. And how do I know that? Because when I was 12, my father told me his story. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
When writing the book, I went to Hungary and I met with a historian, Professor Chapati, who wrote the history of the work camp where my father was.
Hmm.
Chapati had reached out to my dad while writing his book, and my father, who was this classic European gentleman, never been rude to anybody in his life, was unpleasant to Chapati.
Hmm.
And my mom told me when you meet with him, the first thing you do is you apologize. And so when I met with Chapati in Hungary in a coffee shop, he speaks no English, I speak no Hungarian. There was a translator, and the first words out of my mouth was the first words out of my mouth to Chapati was, "My mom says I have to apologize." He says, "That is correct. You do." I said, "Okay." Now with that out of the way, right? He said, "What do you know about how your father survived?" And I told him what I had been told by my dad when I was 12. And Professor Chapati said to me, not a word of truth in that story.
Hmm.
And he said, "Let me tell you how your dad survived," which is an extraordinary story. When I came back to Israel, I said to my mom, I said, "So tell me, how did he survive?" And she told me word for word what he had told me when I was 12.
Hmm.
And I said to her, "That's not the truth. That's not the story." Um, and she said, "Well, why didn't he ever tell me?" And I was like, "Wait a minute. Why didn't you ever tell me?" They never shared their stories with each other.
Hmm.
Was his story and the other guys from Hungary's story wildly different? Or was it like, you don't have to go into details if it's so long, right? But like,
No,
but it's like, was it
no,
like some
I get
version
it.
of the
Nope,
truth?
nope, two totally um, difference between my hair and Josh's hair. Two, the only truth was that in both stories that my father was in this camp called Bor, BOR, in Serbia, Yugoslavia.
Okay.
My father survived 2 death marches, and when they were freed by Tito's partisans, we have this documented. My father led a group of guys in a 134-kilometer walk in the middle of the winter through the Carpathian Mountains. My image of my dad had always been someone who couldn't get from the living room to the front door without my mother helping him. And that was clearly an image, if that's the right word, a persona he created. And when I shared with my friends who know my besties from high school, college, who know my dad, I said, "Dudes, do you know how he survived this thing?" They were like, "No way," because your dad, my dad was a Professor Guiora, Professor Guiora, Professor Guiora, and Susie, I need a cup of tea, right? And then we have 3 kids. I have 2 sons, and they said, "Well, show us the walk he did," and they were like, "We're going to honor him, and we're going to do this 134-kilometer walk." And then they started looking at the Carpathian Mountains, like this, like this, like this. And both my sons are in shape, right? They said, "Wait, there's no way." And my father, who couldn't get to the front, but it was a persona. And I don't know enough about Holocaust survivor literature to know about if other Holocaust survivors create this persona of, I can't, I'm helpless, I can't, I can't, I can't. The only time this became an issue when I was 15, the pain in the ass teenager, I said to my dad, I said, "Listen, everybody's father does something, plays tennis, plays golf, plays baseball, dot, 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 dot. You're the only father who doesn't do a damn thing." We were in my parents living in our living room in Ann Arbor. And my father said to me very quietly, "Shh, I survived the Holocaust. Don't you think that's enough?" And I just walked backwards to my bedroom because there's not
Crazy
anything.
response.
I mean, I'm probably still walking backwards, right? I mean, there's nothing you can say.
No, there's no
Wow.
comeback to that one.
Wow. Yeah, I'm just thinking about the Carpathian Mountains and how much of a journey that alone would be, and then with the trauma and the backstory.
Good point.
Yeah.
So sorry, I
Um,
want to get correct. Sorry, real quick. He walked to those mountains as part of the death march or for freedom?
So the called Bor, BOR, in Serbia, has been identified by Holocaust scholars as the single most violent, not concentration camp, but work camp. It was a mining camp. The Nazis needed the iron for the war machine. In October, November 44, when the Russian army is coming from the east, is when the camps were closed. There were, depends on the numbers, depends who you want to believe, there were between 8 to 10,000 Jews in the camp, divided into two groups. The first group was marched back to Hungary, and when they got to the Hungarian border, they were all massacred. The second group, my father's, was marched from the camp to a city called Nich, which I'm sure I'm mispronouncing. And when they got to Nich, it was, again, plus minus 5 days after the first group. Tito's partisans had time to set up an ambush. And they killed most of the guards who were leading the march for Nich back to Hungary. And they killed most of the guards. And now you have, again, depends on the numbers, yes. And then my dad led a group from here to Sofia in Bulgaria. How do we know he led them? Because when I met with Professor Chapati, he said, your father's the one who led them. I said, Professor Chapati, my dad can't get to the front door. And I said, how do you know this? He said, I interviewed everybody who your father led. Your father's the only one who wouldn't talk to me. And they all said it was your father who, no map, no Google Earth, no compass, no anything. It's an incredible story.
Yeah.
On the other hand, he couldn't get to the front door without my mom making a cup of tea for him. But I'm sure there's a lot of literature about Holocaust survivors who create this persona, if that's the right word, that maybe minimizes the extraordinary, unimaginable bravery, courage that they had. I mean, there was no plan B here.
Yeah. Wow. Thanks for sharing more of that. That blows my mind.
Totally.
So he was in this speech that he gave. He was really kind of focused on this idea of reconciliation within Judaism and the Catholic Church. Is that kind of
Judaism
really
and Christianity? Well, that's interesting. I think more correctly, between Judaism and Christianity. I don't know if between Judaism, it's an interesting question you ask, between Judaism and Catholicism or Judaism and Christianity. I don't know enough. I do know at some point after the talk, my father had three different subsets of his extremely successful academic career. I mean, one of his articles is cited still 60 years later, which is remarkable, right? The last project he was working on was the psychology of the interpreters of the Bible.
Wow, that's interesting.
It is very interesting. And there were people he was reaching out to, working with, and when he died, my mom asked one of my best friends, who's a Presbyterian pastor, who my father was consulting with while writing the article. I mean, my dad had a relationship with my friend independent of me. She asked if he had written enough for us to be able to complete the article. That happens sometimes. And unfortunately, the answer was that my father had not written enough. But I think, and my friend would probably know more than I do, I think that project was probably based on the talk, because this whole notion of biblical liturgy, if that's the right word. My great grandfather was the chief Satmar Orthodox rabbi of Eastern Hungary.
Wow.
But it's complicated because in 1939, this goes to your question. It's very complicated. By the way, if I were ever to write this book, this would be an important part of the book. In 1939, my paternal grandfather, the one of the four books, was able to receive certificates that would have enabled them to leave Hungary and move to Palestine before the Holocaust. My great-grandfather, the Satmar rabbi, said no, because according to Orthodoxy, you couldn't move to Palestine before the Messiah arrives. So one of the issues in Holocaust studies that nobody wants to address is the role of Orthodox rabbis. My great-grandfather said no, as a result of which we could have a conversation about directly or indirectly. His daughter, my grandmother, and his son-in-law, my grandfather, were murdered. Now, my great-grandfather and his wife died of natural causes in 1942, 1943, before the Holocaust that comes to Hungary.
Mm.
But his decision to say no, contributed. We could have a long conversation about to what degree to the murder of his daughter and son-in-law, and I assume X number of his congregants, because as I say, he was the chief rabbi, chief Satmar rabbi of Eastern Hungary. There's even a book of important Hungarian rabbis, and my great-grandfather's, prominent, not prominent in the book. And somewhere we have a picture of him. He honestly looks like Moses on the mountaintop. I mean, really good-looking guy, and complicated, right? Because he said no.
Yeah, no, that's a huge role. First of all, they wear the big velvet hats and the Satmar Rebbe, and like to
the
be
chief
the
rabbi is
of
the chief
all,
rabbi.
Yeah, and to make that decision. Wow. Going back to your father, how do you think, to the extent that he did through this lecture, this talk he gave, how do you think he found it in himself to sort of forgive? It wasn't directly the perpetrators, but sort of the
No, I think the perpetrators.
system, the perpetrators. Yeah. How do you think he
Interesting.
found that in him?
I have absolutely no idea. And as much as I had this, and I'm very, 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 very fortunate that I've had this great relationship with my father, I think I am as, I don't want to say befuddled, but as ignorant, I think, today as I was when Dr. Barnett first called me. If not for, I mean, think about serendipity, right? If not for me reaching out to Barnett, this talk would have been, I never knew about this. There had been an article here in Israel, in Haaretz, our New York Times, about the conference, which it didn't even register with me. I didn't even know about this. What is it that led my father? I don't know if the word is forgive, reconciliation, I guess is the right. Is reconciliation, forgive the same thing? I don't know. But
somehow to make amends or make peace with what happened.
Yeah. My father in no way was not there was no anger in him.
Wow.
But that doesn't mean that you reconcile, right? But that, when he wrote this thing in, I think 25 years ago.
Do you think there was?
I am embarrassingly ignorant.
Do you think there was anger, and that was we're obviously speaking of maybe in certainties, but you think there was anger in him over time, and that's why he wouldn't talk about some of these things? Because you're kind of, I think one of the interesting dynamics is you have a great relationship with your father, which I think is awesome, but at the same time there's this aspect in this world that he would not talk about. And I guess in my head it's like, if you have such a great relationship, you think some of that would be sort of interwoven right throughout life eventually.
Yeah, I get the question. I think
so. Maybe he was angry at one point and then had to, like, over time, by the time this talk happened, potential for, like, I can't live with this. Like, it's too heavy of a burden to bear to be so angry. Maybe, I don't know. And I'm not trying to speak into your father, but just ideas, right?
Totally. I mean, those are excellent questions. For my bar mitzvah trip, we went to Europe. And we went to, I don't know what the hell they were thinking, but we went to Germany.
Oh my gosh.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We had been in Italy, my mom, my dad, and I, and we were in Italy when my maternal grandfather had a heart attack. So my mother left us and she flew off from Italy to Iz, and I stayed with my dad. We went to Cologne in Germany.
Hmm.
May 1970, 25 years after the Holocaust.
Wow.
We stayed in this beautiful, beautiful, beautiful Castle Hotel. The restaurant, greatest dinner ever.
Hmm.
And then my father became violently ill.
Oh.
I'm there with him. I'm 13 years old, and this is before
Mhm.
the cell phone, probably before phones, right? And I'm like thinking, what the hell do we do, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
And we left Germany the next morning. It was terrible. I felt horrible for him. And we went to Holland. And what do Jews do when they go to Amsterdam? They go to the Anne Frank house.
Hmm.
Um,
Sure. I've been to that actually.
There was, yeah.
and we went to the Anne Frank house, my father and I. But if I'm looking at my dad's picture here, probably saying to him, "The hell were you thinking?" Right? And we never talked about it.
Wow.
I remember going to the house, no conversation whatsoever, before, during, or after.
Was he
like
like
he
this,
had-
I guess?
Vini Vici.
Was he like
Yeah.
this always though? Like as a personality, like just didn't talk about a lot? Because like Josh was saying, he's a professor, so he's very
Um,
intellectual, right? And probably can explain and teach things very well.
Sure, absolutely. Um,
Maybe he internalized it, and
Right. Yeah.
that story about him
or
getting
packed
sick,
it,
that makes
packed it
sense. It was
away. Is
like
that the
he
expression? Put
suppressed
it
it
in the
in.
attic.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe it was so traumatic in Germany at some point. Like it just
I think the day that night in Cologne, but years later they went to Germany a lot because he was invited regularly by some university in Germany to teach, to lecture. My mother loved going to Berlin. Um,
Yeah.
they had
Like
been to Hungary. They went to
compartmentalizing
Hungary a couple
in a
times. My
sense.
mother hated going to Hungary. Hated.
Mm.
Um,
Mhm.
I think he taught. I think he gave lectures. I mean, in addition to this Holocaust thing, I think he gave lectures there or talks there. I mean, my dad was my dad. Um, but your question is very interesting. I think on this, lock it and throw the key away.
Mhm.
And I would think if he were here, I think he would say that the effort was not to burden me with.
Mm. Yeah.
I think they viewed it as I don't know if it's the right expression, as doing me a favor.
Mm.
Hmm.
Like giving you a new life, your own life, your own chance to live.
Without burdening me. Yeah, as
I
a matter
think.
of fact, when I started reading about Boer, the camp he had been in, and you read accounts and you see pictures of, I mean, the camp commander, Moroni, I think that was his name, I think, he would whip people to death. Now, whipping to death is an act of brutality that is, it's not, pew pew, you're dead, right? But
yeah.
when I discovered, how my dad had been rescued, freed by Tito, my mom's first question was, what happened to the camp commander? And I actually spent time researching this because, my mom asked me to. And there were two versions as to how he died. Version number one is that after the war, as was the case with other Nazis, the Mossad, killed people. He killed them.
Mm.
And there were versions that he had been drowned in the Seine, the river in Paris. And version number two was he died surrounded by his loving family in his 80s in Austria. And I spent time researching this, and I talked to people who actually know these kinds of things. And they said, sorry to tell you, who died surrounded by his loving family. And when I, went to Mom Guiora and I said, Mom, that bastard died surrounded by his loving family, my mother's only reaction was, oh, shit. And she's right, because this is a guy who deserved to be killed.
Mm.
If you ask me, you don't have to agree with me.
Sure.
He did not deserve to die surrounded by his loving family.
That's exactly true. I happened to have Alan Dershowitz. He wrote a book, a pretty old book, 1980 something, Chutzpah, and I happened to have it. And I was just reading this a few days ago, where he talks about that very issue. Like, if a former Nazi criminal, they live out their days in peace and what, but then someone else, has a horrible end, and so it's not really fair. And that's something that he wrestled with, and sort of why he couldn't deal with the pat answers that was given to him as a child. But And kind of going back to your initiative, there's a quote here. Well, there's several quotes, but basically, the world is never given and does not offer any special indulgence to the Jewish people or the Jewish state. And then he also talks about how he does not believe that the German or Austrian people, those who did not actively oppose Nazism, he believes that they bear considerable moral responsibility for the Holocaust, and that every willing supporter of the Nazism deserves some blame. So I guess in your understanding, what would sort of be proper justice, and how can that be
For
brought
those
about?
who
And
are
then what's the
responsible,
next
I mean,
step?
for
like
those, I mean,
nowadays.
you know, Nuremberg trials. I mean, I am not a proponent of the death penalty. Take Streicher, the guy who had the 9,000 books, or take, you know, Goebbels and others. Some of them, you know, commit, suicided themselves, and those who were hung. You're responsible for the Holocaust. Fine by me. I mean, I don't mean to be flippant, but I think the Nuremberg trials, I know victor's justice, I know all the arguments, but I think that a clear example had to be set that the Holocaust is so fundamentally different from anything else that to keep them in jail for 20 years, 15 years, and then, you know, the denazification in Germany, which I think probably a little bit of BS. I don't want to say comfortable, but I'm comfortable with those who were executed. But no, like the camp commander, you know, I remember saying my mom really was, I don't want to say hoping, but hoping that he had been killed rather than allowed to die again, surrounded by his loving family.
Yeah.
There's a sense of justice, probably, right, that you would like, with a more
Well put.
personal aspect to it. Yeah, like, right.
And listen, I'm not into retribution, Rebecca. I don't know how to think like that. But in this particular case, yes.
So I guess moving on, like, how can Christians today and other people of goodwill, I don't know, not prevent something like this? What's the onus for the next generation, for our generation, and for people to either prevent or to educate themselves, or to
begin with your last word, which is education. I was going to use the word education. I was going to say knowledge. It's complicated because your generation is very much focused, or receives its news
mostly
social media. And the two of you know much more than I do, but I know enough to know that not everything you read on Twitter is correct. And I think one of the great, for me, as raised in the world of books. And I think, to your question, knowledge, reading, curiosity are essential. Two, without being utopian-ish, because I'm not, is this notion of tolerance and not being quick to judge, the rush to judgment. And I do think that social media enhances the rush to judgment. It's a huge problem.
Definitely.
It's a huge problem. Curiosity, the two of you are much too young to know. There's a thing called a library. You ask your grandparents. There's this thing called a library.
I got library books here, man.
Well, look at you, the Dewey Decimal System. I think I don't want to say that's a lost art, because that's an exaggeration, but I think that's critical. And I think the last thing I would say, I think I'm right that Professor Elizabeth Scary coined the phrase the echo chamber. I think I'm giving her credit. And if I'm not, she deserves credit for her other work. The echo chamber is a real problem, and the social media plays into the echo chamber. And I think it's really important to step outside that comfort zone. Listen, it's no fun. It's hard.
Right.
It's much easier to sit around and hear yourselves, each other.
Yeah.
And I think that I think again, the two of you know much more than I do. Social media creates, in essence, this polarization. I mean, I go to my websites, you go to your websites, and I read what I read, and you read what you read, and you watch your TV stations, I watch my TV stations, and that's a problem. That's why curiosity
Mhm.
is essential. And
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
also, one other point I would make, it's okay to disagree. We don't have to
Mm.
agree.
Mm.
Of course, I'm a firm believer in civil disagreement,
Right.
but I live here in Israel, and I'm an active protester, demonstrator against Netanyahu. I have a book
Mm.
coming out about Netanyahu's enablers. It's my newest book.
Interesting. Wow. Okay.
Um,
That'd
I've
be
been to
interesting.
who knows how many demonstrations. I've had
Mm.
more verbal interactions, polite word, with Netanyahu supporters and with the police, and my book is coming out about them. Um, Israeli society, it's contentious, unrelated to Iran. And for me, all roads run through the 53 hostages still being held, and not, unfortunately, not
Mhm.
everybody
Mhm.
agrees with that. They've been, he's abandoned by the government,
Mm.
and so it's okay. I mean, we disagree here in Israel. I mean, we have, a verbal. I don't know if the word in English is verbal violence, verbal altercations, verbal heated. Oh yeah, I mean, I've been there, and trust me on this one. I give as good as I take.
Yeah.
And
Hebrew
I
and Yiddish
do.
is kind of easier to do that with
Sure.
natural English.
I've been physically accosted by the police, and that's
Mhm.
okay. I mean, it's not okay, but that's just the way it is. Because I happen to believe in the rule of law, fighting against the judicial reform, and I happen to believe in that we're abandoning the hostages and fighting for democracy. That's what it takes. So to your question, I mean, and I think probably the other thing, maybe taking it all together, is this notion of engagement. Passivity is a terrible, terrible, terrible thing, or complicity. Somewhere there's a passivity, complicity. I
Mhm.
don't know which comes first. Time. You do the spectrum thing. Um, I think it's. I think that engagement is the critical word.
Getting involved, showing up. Okay.
Mhm.
I have one other question, and it's sort of it's actually about a more specific thing. You're on the board of directors of the Lauren McCluskey Foundation. The reason I
Absolutely.
bring this up is because I'm actually sitting in Pullman, Washington right now,
Ah,
where I did my undergrad and my master's. So I knew about Lauren McCluskey. Yeah, I was here when that happened, and so
mm.
she was a track star that grew up in Pullman, and then she
Sure.
attended
Because
the
they're
University of
because
Utah.
because because Matt
They're
and Jill teach
professors.
at Washington State,
Hmm.
right?
Exactly. And so, and she was murdered by someone that she
By a
trusted or
former
she
by a,
thought she
by a
trusted.
former relationship in Salt Lake City, right?
Yeah. So I'm wondering if you could just briefly touch on that and
Absolutely. So
I
Lauren McCluskey was a track star student at the University of Utah who was murdered by whatever the term is, former boyfriend, former relationship. Lauren and her friends had gone to the university officials a number of times with he had been threatening her sexting. I think is that the right number? Um, and indeed he murdered her. She was on the phone with Jill. Um, Grabbed her, killed her. And for me, one of the great honors is to be on the board, and I think that the reason that the McCluskeys invited me to be on the board is because of my work on enablers and bystanders. And I think
yeah.
that I'm not putting words in their mouths, but I think from their perspective, the failure to protect Lauren was a result of enabling. And I mean, I am on other boards as well, but there's no doubt that to be on the McCluskey Family Foundation board is one of the great honors because I teach at Utah. I never met Lauren, but Lauren's running partner, because I'm tracking, was a student of mine also,
Mm.
and yeah, I think that her horrific murder forced a lot of us to ask ourselves the role of campus safety, campus security, and enabling.
Hmm.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, such a beautiful, beautiful life. She was a runner, which we all share that. The three of us really share that in common, I think. And so yeah, basically, if someone knows something that's happening, they know that someone's being threatened, or they know someone is going through something, they need to stand up and say
correct.
something, right?
Totally. And what Jill and Matt and the board are really focused on is campus safety, campus security, domestic violence, intimate partner violence. And at the end of the day, the question is, to whom do you owe the duty? And the duty was owed to Lauren McCluskey. Full stop. No ands, no ifs, no buts.
Yeah. If you say something if you know something's going on. I think that definitely. Is there anything you want to leave us with? Tommy, do you have anything to?
No, I don't. I just want to say thank you. Really insightful, really intriguing, to a lot of crazy stories, like in a good way, right? And I know some of it's from a not so good place, but thanks for taking the time.
Thanks for having me.
Really grateful.
Yeah.
All right, fellas. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. This has been an honor.
Appreciate it. Be well, my friends.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Praying for a better, safer future.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Amen to that. Bye.
Amen.
Amen.
Bye.